Okay, hello everyone. So this presentation that I'm giving today examines groupthink and how it contributes to the us versus them philosophy, especially amongst voting behavior in the United States. The core idea is that groupthink can push people to value in-group loyalty more than careful evaluation of things like evidence or policies or outcomes, right? So in a politically polarized climate, that pressure can shape what people say publicly, what they also share online within their social media frameworks, right? And even what they come to believe privately with things like religion or whatever. So, across the next few slides, I'm going to explain the origin of the issue, the causes that sustain it, and the current problems that it's creating. And also, we'll look at the future dangers if this continues. And I hope to potentially set out a solution that could reduce this conformity pressure and improve civic judgment. So, what I'll also do is include some of what we've seen here by Dr. Les Carter and his emphasis on learning from people who think differently. This issue, it can be described as identity driven voting, where political choices are guided primarily by who belongs to us and who belongs to them, right? We see that left versus right. And in this pattern, voting becomes less about weighing evidence and weighing facts, but more about signaling loyalty to a group or a tribe, right? So, from a groupthink perspective, the danger of this is that the group's shared identity can end up becoming a substitute for independent personal judgment, which is one of the things that I believe the framers of this country and this Constitution laid out for us. Now, when belonging matters to a group or to a person intensely, we know that people may adopt the group's preferred beliefs very quickly. And this avoids them raising any doubts. And they end up treating disagreements as disloyalty, these groups do, right? So, and Dr. Carter talks a lot about this. We also read a lot about this in Turner. But over time, group membership can shape perceptions of things like what is moral, what is true, what is safe to say, what do I believe, right? So groupthink research that we're drawing off of, particularly Carter and Turner here, groupthink research highlights that highly cohesive groups can drift towards poor decision making when dissent is discouraged, but consensus is treated as the highest goal, right? And I think that's what Turner and Pratkanis are getting to way back in 1998. So that's an interesting point. Okay, so groupthink offers us a very useful lens on this because it explains how groups can unintentionally create conditions that reduce critical thinking. So in politics, people often join groups to feel connected or to feel protected or to feel understood, right? But what happens when those groups become highly cohesive and emotionally charged, right? Well, what happens is they develop norms that reward agreement and they punish questioning, right? So groupthink conditions tend to include self-censorship or pressure towards uniformity, or maybe even a preference for quick consensus over careful analysis of an issue, right? So in an us versus them environment, the group may interpret disagreement as a betrayal system rather than a contribution to society as a whole. Now that social meaning matters because it changes how people behave. And that's really important. We have to keep that in mind. Because instead of asking, is this claim well supported? People may in turn ask, does this claim help our side? That shift is central to how groupthink can distort uh, political judgment. And I think Turner in 1998 really does point that out to us a whole lot. Now, we're going to try here to understand why identity voting exists in the first place. And it helps us notice that social life includes a lot of incentives. And people are influenced by the rewards of acceptance and the cost of rejection. Evidence has shown us that time and time again. So when a political identity becomes a major source of belonging, many people respond by aligning their opinions with what the group expects. And this can sometimes happen without formal pressure. Sometimes that pressure is very subtle, right? Like gaining approval through likes on Facebook or thumbs up or praises, or maybe they're just including you into this group. And sometimes it can be direct, as well. Like, they can mock you, they can shame you. Some religious groups kind of shun you, that they can throw threats of social exclusion your way, and over time, these incentives or disincentives can shape public expression and even shape your private belief. So social influence can end up creating a feedback loop where individuals express the group line, rather, right? The party line, that expression reinforces apparent consensus. And that consensus strengthens conformity pressure. And that, if we look at it this way, it kind of helps explain why people may endorse claims that are weakly supported but strongly identity confirming. And one issue of this is we had a state senator here in Texas that was discussing these furries, that we see around. It's a identity thing. He went and claimed that there was a public school in Texas that was providing litter boxes for students who claimed to be furries. And when he was confronted by this, he said, "Can you give me the proof of what school it was?" He didn't have one. This is a perfect example of how this conformity pressure, he was pressured by a group to just say something and he said it. And it didn't matter whether it was right or wrong. So one area that interests me particularly is digital environments. And digital environments can intensify groupthink dynamics because they're designed around visibility. They're designed around engagement. And they're designed around rapid social feedback. So when people interact with mainly like-minded accounts, right, they're more likely to encounter repeating narratives that confirm the group's overall kind of worldview. That repetition can create the illusion that most reasonable people would agree. Now, this increases conformity pressure, but it also decreases curiosity about alternatives. Now, one thing that we see is that social media also makes consequences much more immediate. People can be rewarded very quickly for signaling loyalty, but they can also be punished very quickly for expressing some sort of nuance. And research on social media use and perceptions of reality suggest that online context can shape how individuals interpret information and how strongly they feel their group alignment is. Now, there's some other academic research, like Dennison here, that I'm pointing to, that discusses social conformity and individuality in online spaces, which is very relevant because the political climate now lives partly within the digital ecosystem. And in short, what I'm trying to say here is online reinforcement can speed up groupthink patterns. That's what Dennison is trying to tell us here. I really love this quote right here, and I found this while I was researching this idea of groupthink by Pythagoras. I know I'm probably going to get his name wrong, but just deal with it because I don't speak Greek. But Pythagoras, I wonder if he's the one that came up with that whatever. Anyway, he says, Do not take roads traveled by the public." That's a very interesting quote, and that leads us more to this group thing. Okay, so one major cause of groupthink in politics is high cohesion, meaning that groups feel emotionally important and socially necessary. That is something really important that we need to look at here. So when cohesion is high, members often protect the group's unity because unity feels like safety. Now, in politics, high cohesion can develop when people feel threatened by cultural change or by economic uncertainty, or maybe there's perceived hostility from the other side, right versus left, left versus right. The group's identity then becomes a form of a psychological shelter, if you will, right? Whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter. The problem is that cohesion can also reduce the willingness to challenge the group's assumptions. You don't want to speak out against the group that's accepting you. Now, members of the certain group may fear that disagreement will damage relationships or their social loyalty within the group. Groupthink research that we've seen here, especially what we're looking at with Turner, warns us that when cohesion and loyalty are emphasized, groups oftentimes avoid realistic appraisal and become much more confident in their position than the evidence supports. This dynamic can shape voting, it can shape messaging, it can shape the acceptance of claims that fit into the group identity rather than reality. This is the real problem. Second cause here is the structure of social incentives. People often adjust what they say and what they do to maintain social standing and to maintain their belonging in a certain group, right? And in political life, these incentives can become very powerful because political identity is frequently tied to community membership. It's also tied very closely to your family relationships, or to your workplace culture or your online social networks, right? So when group loyalty becomes a valued signal, the agreement with that signal is socially rewarded. So, meanwhile, on the flip side of that coin, questioning the group can bring social cost, right? Such as being labeled as naive, or maybe they'll say you're disloyal or morally suspect, whatever the case may be. That environment encourages conformity and makes self censorship feel very rational. So, social influence scholarship, some of the research that we've seen out there, describes how reputational concerns can shape people's behavior, including who and what they publicly endorse. And we see that a lot today. So if a person believes that dissent will lead to exclusion, the easiest path is often silence or alignment. Now, over time, that pattern supports groupthink, and it makes that kind of us versus them idea feel much more stable. And that's what we read here in some of the scholarship with Benabo, I think it is, that in 2009. Man, I'm horrible with some of these names, but we read this in some of the scholarly research here that I pulled up for this. Now, the cause to this is echo chamber exposure. And echo chamber exposure is often intensified very largely by platform dynamics. So, whether we're on social media or whether we're in person, but when people engage with content or with a message that supports their worldview, platforms typically respond by showing them more of the same kind of content, or they feed them more of that same kind of food, right? This is a result of narrowed information environments where the out group is mainly seen through negative examples and simplified stereotypes. This affects judgment because people become much less likely to encounter credible counter arguments, and they're more likely to treat their group's narrative as obvious truth. So let's think about this. If you go to your local Republican club, and that's the only club that you ever go to, and all you do is hang around people who validate your worldview, and you never go to the Democrat social club and hear what they got to say, all you're doing is ever really hearing out one side of the argument. Okay, and I saw this a lot when I worked in the news media. That if you're a pretty conservative person, you generally watch Fox News. If you're pretty liberal, you watch MSNBC. If you're kind of right down the middle and you don't care, you read the Associated Press, right? That's just kind of how it works. And in groupthink terms, this because what you're doing, let me back up there, because what you're doing there is you're not so much seeking out the news, you end up seeking a validation for your worldview. The news as you see it, right? So In groupthink terms, this resembles insulation. Okay. It protects you. It's like an insulation from corrective feedback, right? And some of the research that we've seen here applies groupthink to social media context and student perceptions of reality, and how it suggests that social environments can shape what seems plausible or what seems normal. So when a person's social media feed, let's say, is repeatedly reinforcing the same moral framing, the mind starts to experience that framing as common sense. It starts to make you believe that this is what's right. And this is a strong foundation for this us versus them voting rights, or voting habit, I should say, here that we're seeing in the United States. Now, I'm going to lay out a fourth cause here for you in the way that groups sometimes moralize disagreement. And in highly polarized climates, disagreement is not treated as a neutral difference in reasoning. It's really not, no matter how we look at it. Instead, it is treated as a sign of poor character or betrayal. Once that norm becomes common, dissent becomes personally risky to you. Okay? So people learn very quickly that asking critical questions can lead to social punishment. But if you repeat the group messages, that can get you approval. Now, some of the research that we've seen here on groupthink, and again, I'm quoting Turner here, some of this research emphasizes patterns like self censorship and direct pressure towards uniformity. And those patterns map very well onto political settings where loyalty tests really do exist. Another consequence of moralized disagreement is the group's confidence grows because alternative perspectives are not expressed openly. This creates a misleading sense of unanimous, you get it. Then the group's worldview kind of begins to harden, right? And members become much more committed to identity based voting rather than evidence based evaluation of the issue. And I think that's something that Turner is pointing to here. Again, I really love this quote here by James Surowiecki. He says, "In conditions of uncertainty, humans, like other animals, herd together for protection." There's a lot of truth to that. And I want you to just to stop and let that sink in for a little bit, because there's a lot of truth to that. Okay, so one of the major problems that we're seeing here is that complex political issues or social issues, right, become very oversimplified into these binary choices, okay? What I mean by that are like things like good versus evil, smart versus stupid, uh, patriot versus enemies, right? So when groupthink is activated, right, when it moves in, the group's consensus can substitute for careful reasoning. Instead of helping a person kind of evaluate evidence and trade-offs, people might not be able to adopt the or people may be able to, rather, I should say, they may be able to adopt the group's preferred interpretation immediately. This action itself reduces critical thinking and increases the chance of decision errors. What we also learned from some academic research is that it also encourages overconfidence because the group can mistake agreement for correctness. We saw that in the last political election when everybody thought that, or presidential election, when the Democrats were very confident that they were going to win a majority of the votes and they didn't. So what we see is that in this groupthink study, right, reduced realistic appraisal is a core concern because groups ignore warning signs and they dismiss outside expertise. That's kind of what I believe as a strategist. That's what I believe is kind of happening with the Republican Party right now. They're not listening to the outside warnings, and that's going to come back to hurt them, just like it came back to hurt the Democrats. So in an us versus them kind of voting behavior, this oversimplification of things helps mobilize loyalty. It helps move things along, right? But it can also weaken the problem solving that you're trying to deal with. So people become less able to discuss nuances, less willing to revise the way that they believe, and they become more likely to treat politics as tribal conflict rather than civic cooperation. And do you see the problem with that? Now, another problem that we have here is self censorship. So that's where people hide their doubts because of disagreement, right? And that disagreement feels very socially dangerous. So, in a polarized environment, let's say a person might have nuanced values, but they remain very quiet to avoid conflicts with friends or family or online communities or political groups or religious groups, whatever. That silence matters because it changes what the group believes about itself. Did you hear me? That silence matters because that silence can change what the group believes about itself. If dissent was not ever voiced, members may assume that everyone just agrees with them. This is how an illusion of consensus forms, which then increases conformity pressure. So, as we've read some of this research on groupthink, we've identified that self censorship is a key mechanism that prevents groups from correcting errors. Social influence scholarship, some of the research that's out there, highlights how reputational concerns can shape public expression, whether it's in politics or whatever. But especially in politics, self censorship contributes to a greater extremity because most people are just not willing to speak as often as other people. And that changes how the group begins to think. So over time, moderation becomes invisible, and us versus them voting becomes much more dominant. And that's what we're seeing here with Turner. Groupthink can worsen polarization by rewarding messages that increase in group pride, okay, or out group content, right? So when the group defines itself in opposition to another group, right, it becomes easier to stereotype and dehumanize the other side. You're making them look bad. The out group is seen less as a community of humans and more like animals, right? And people think that they're mixed with all kinds of motives and all this and that, and then that group becomes a single threatening entity, right? So this changes the moral psychology of this because empathy within the group declines, but hostility becomes socially acceptable. And the digital ecosystems that we all kind of live in today likely intensify this through repeated exposure to inflammatory content, and it offers social rewards for strong identity signaling. Now, research on social media use, and I'll point this out here through Denison, and there's some other research out there that supports this, but some of this research shows that conformity pressures and the shaping of perceptions help explain why people can move towards more extreme views without being directly persuaded. So when the group's identity is strengthened by conflict, the conflict kind of becomes it becomes kind of self-sustaining, right? So that creates a social environment where cooperation and compromise makes it seems kind of weak, right? Loyalty to the cause becomes the real primary virtue, and we've seen that cause some real problems all throughout history. Now, a serious problem is that groupthink can distort reality perception. This is a real serious problem. But when loyalty matters more than accuracy, people likely accept the claims because the claims support identity, not because the claims are true. Okay? Groups can become very vulnerable to misinformation when social validation replaces external verification. And that's a really important thing for us to look at in terms of the media. So let's just say a claim that is shared widely within a group can feel true because it's a popular opinion or a popular claim. This is especially risky, I think, when information is emotionally charged and it's framed more as a threat from the out group, right? The opposition. And one thing that comes to mind here is you remember Q, some of you will remember QAnon. That was a prime example of this. And research that connects social media environments to perceptions of reality and groupthink frameworks, they all suggest that social context can shape what people interpret as credible. So when groups treat information as a loyalty signal, correcting misinformation can feel like you're attacking their identity. And that makes correction even harder, and it makes misinformation a much more stickier thing to deal with. So in political climates, this pattern contributes to distrust. It contributes to outrage and decision making that it creates decision making that's very poorly linked to objective evidence. Kind of like the guy here in Texas saying that they were putting litter boxes in schools for kids who identified as animals, which they never did find. Quote here, another simple little quote here: being a wise ass in a group think environment is like throwing an egg at a bulldozer. Matt Tabby. That's a very wise quote. Um, it's true. I'll just leave it at that. It's true. So what happens if this continues? Well, if this continues, identity voting may become even more dominant in our societies. And in that future, political behavior is going to be guided primarily by what protects group belonging and not what protects good government. People may vote to maintain identity status within a group and also punish the outgroup people that they disagree with. Or they may do it just to signal some loyalty, even when the policies that they have conflict with their material interest, okay? The things that they really do believe in their heart. And so social influence research, some of the scholarship on this, helps explain this progression because reputational incentives can become much stronger as polarization rises. And believe it or not, we see this a lot, especially in our smaller communities. You know, you're identified by where you work or who you work with or who you hang out with or whatever, right? So as more people signal loyal publicly, wherever you go, the cost of dissent increases. So that way the group's narrative becomes harder and harder to challenge because disagreement triggers social penalties. You can get fired, you can get kicked out of the club, you can get shunned out of church, whatever. And this progression also reduces the group trust, the cross group trust, right? So when each side kind of begins to interpret the other as being fundamentally illegitimate or dangerous, and persuasion of the groups become much less possible. We see this polarized politics. The result is a political culture where evidence is filtered through identity and where democratic cooperation really does begin to weaken. And in psychological terms, the group becomes a primary reference point for reality. Independent judgment, which is what everybody should be focusing on, becomes much less common. Now, a second future danger is increasing extremity. And I want to explain to you what I mean by that. Because when dissent is punished, moderate members of the group either become silent or they leave the conversation altogether. That shifts the group's visible norm towards stronger and more rigid positions. Then the remaining voices reinforce one another, which can escalate certainty and hostility, right? So some of the research on groupthink warns us that insulated groups can develop unrealistic confidence and they can ignore counter evidence and make riskier decisions. In politics, that can mean supporting policies without adequate scrutiny and endorsing leaders without any accountability. Does that sound familiar? Or they can perhaps embrace narratives that justify aggression towards your opponents. The mechanism is not only belief change here, it is also behavioral change because people say more extreme things when they're rewarded for it. We see that all the time. People say more extreme things when they get rewarded for it. Hello to the podcasters of the world. But over time, the political environment becomes less capable of course correction. And we know that because we've looked at the data and we've looked at the history of that. The group's internal agreement becomes the primary measure of truth. The systems become more volatile, and that's how this becomes more and more dangerous. Now, this third danger is perhaps what I think one of the uh, most dangerous is, and that's the erosion of democratic norms. So when the us versus them mentality becomes the dominant frame, institutional outcomes are interpreted as wins and losses for the tribe as a whole, rather than legitimate processes. Trust in elections, trust in courts, trust in science, trust in journalism, or trust in public administration really begins to weaken if each institution is judged mainly by whether it serves the in group or the out group. That's a real problem. This creates a very high risk environment because democratic systems depend on some sort of baseline acceptance of procedures, even when the outcomes disappoint you. That is a fact of life. Now, some of the research on this, tying it back to groupthink perspectives, teach us that in social environments, this can help explain how collective narratives shape perceptions of reality versus legitimacy. So when groups treat the out group as a morally unacceptable group or something like that, compromise becomes very dishonorable and governance becomes very unstable. If this progression continues, I think political conflict can become more persistent and it becomes much more personal with increasing difficulties in addressing shared problems such as things like economic stability or public health or national security, however you want to look at it. And I think Pippas is one of the research that I quoted here, addresses that very, very strongly about how polarized ecosystems can intensify the way that people participate. Now, a final future danger of this is the normalization of hostility and the increase of psychological strain on the community and individuals. Constant us versus them engagement encourages vigilance, but it also encourages anger and suspicion. And that can affect mental health and it can really affect social relationships because people as individuals end up feeling pressured to perform loyalty. They feel like they have to monitor their speech or to avoid relationships that cross political boundaries. This reduces social connectedness and it can also increase stress. Social media conformity pressures can intensify this because identity signaling is often public and permanent. Now, some of the research on conformity and individuality in online context anyway is relevant here because it suggests that individuals can experience tension between belonging and authenticity. So when authenticity is punished and conformity is rewarded, psychological well-being can really suffer. And in a long-term political climate, this strain can become socially contagious and it can shape community life or it can even shape family systems and workplace relationships. So, what does that mean? That means that groupthink is not only a civic problem, groupthink is a mental health problem. And I point at Denison to drive that home. Now, there is a potential solution. But I want to bring this up here, this quote by Frank Sonnenberg here. He said, "Do you think for yourself or yield for popular opinion?" I think that's a question that we should all ask ourselves. Now, the solution goal here is not to eliminate disagreement. That's not what anyone is trying to do. The goal is to reduce groupthink pressure so that disagreement becomes safer and much more productive. Now, some of the research out there supports strategies that increase critical evaluation and it welcomes dissent and reduces the social cost of questioning. In the political context, the aim has to be to shift from loyalty equals agreement to loyalty includes honesty. That change matters because democracy depends on citizens who can evaluate information, who can tolerate complexity, and who can collaborate across their differences. That's when the political system works the most. Effective solutions also recognize that identity needs are real. People want to feel belonging. They want to feel like they belong there. And the problem is that when belonging requires intellectual surrender, you start running into some hurdles. So the solution should be to preserve belonging while strengthening a person's individual judgment. That means designing cultural norms and conversational practices that invite curiosity, that require evidence, and it rewards intellectual humility. So when groups learn to treat dissent as a contribution rather than a threat, they become much more accurate, they become far less extreme, and they become far more capable of problem solving. And I think Turner points that out very, very well in her work. A very powerful cultural intervention is the norm that difference is not defective. And I think Dr. Les Carter in the video that I have linked here emphasizes learning from people who think very differently. And he argues that there's nothing wrong with being or thinking differently. This message directly challenges the emotional fuel of us versus them politics, which often treats difference as danger. If groups adopt Carter's stance as value, they can reduce the urge to punish dissent. Practically, I think this means praising people who ask sincere or genuine questions, and we can reward nuance, and we can treat disagreement as a sign of engagement rather than a signal of disloyalty. And some of the scholarly research out there suggests that groups make better decisions when members are free to raise concerns without fear. And Carter's point here provides the moral language needed to make that freedom socially acceptable, right? And so the outcome is much more healthy, and it's a healthier political climate where people can learn from each other. They can grow their views and they can connect across group boundaries without losing their sense of belonging. And that's very, very important. Now, there are some structural solutions out there that are focused on how conversations are organized. One evidence informed approach is to build cross cutting exposure through structured dialogue norms. An example of this would be before responding to an opposing view, participants must be able to summarize the other position very accurately, right? So, in a way that the person would endorse what they're trying to say. This reduces what we call straw manning and enforces cognitive engagement. And another norm is evidence first, right? We need to put the evidence first for strong claims require support beyond group agreement, such as credible sources or verified data. For example, putting the litter box in the Texas public schools. These structures counter the illusion of unanimity. See, I'm going to get this right by making room for competing interpretations that are out there. Research connecting social media dynamics and groupthink frameworks suggests that information environments shape reality as a perception. So, the structure of exposure really does matter. If people are only exposed to in group narratives and they never look outside the group, then groupthink tends to grow. If exposure is diversified and dialogue is disciplined, groupthink weakens. The purpose is not forced agreement. The purpose is improved judgment. Another point that I think Turner makes very well. So, individual skill building is the final solution layer. People can learn to notice when belonging is driving belief. A useful practice is to ask if my group disagreed with me, what would I think? And what evidence might would change my mind? Another practice is deliberate exposure to credible dissent, not for entertainment, but for learning. And this aligns with the idea that individuality can coexist with social connection. Now, research on social media and how we interact with social media and conformity and individuality, some of that research highlights that individuals experience tension between fitting in and expressing authentic judgment. Conformity resistance does not mean rejecting community. It means remaining intellectually responsible to the community. And Dr. Les Carter, his message supports this stance because it frames differences as being acceptable and valuable. So when individuals internalize that norm, they speak more honestly and they're willing to test their beliefs more rigorously, and they reduce the social spread of groupthink. So over time, individual habits can shift, and so can group norms. And finally, I want to thank you for sticking with me because this reference slide signals the end, and it documents the sources that informed this presentation and shows how I use them ethically without copying any of the text. Throughout the slides, I included them in APA 7 in-text citation for you, where specific claims or frameworks can come from. Um, but I do appreciate you sticking with my very bad teleprompter skills, and my sometimes using bigger words than I'm capable of pronouncing. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it.